All right, let's just jump right in with a pretty huge question. What if? What if the central figure of Christianity has been, well, fundamentally misunderstood for almost 2,000 years? We're going to unpack a really provocative thesis today from an author who says that the shift from Hebrew to Greek wasn't just a name change. No, they argue it might have betrayed the entire essence of the message. So let's get into it.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. First up, we'll dig into this core idea of a betrayal. Then, we'll look at the actual evidence from ancient scrolls. After that, we'll see how things might have gotten lost in translation. We'll also cover the author's suggestion for reclaiming what they call a more Hebraic faith, and we'll wrap up with the big question this leaves for believers.
So, the source material we're looking at, it really doesn't pull any punches. I mean, it frames the entire discussion around this one pretty intense question. The implication is huge, that maybe, just maybe, many followers have accidentally strayed from the original Jewish identity and teachings of their faith's founder. So you might be asking, where does an idea this big even come from? Well, the author builds their entire case on the incredible work of a scholar named Professor David Flusser. And it's important to know, Flusser was a respected Orthodox Jewish scholar who spent his entire life studying the historical Jesus.
And this quote, this is really the core of the whole argument. Flusser says, as far as you depart from the Hebrew background of the Gospels, as far as you go farther from the Jewishness of Jesus, I would even say you betray Jesus himself. Wow. I mean, that is incredibly direct. He's not just saying the Jewish context is nice to have. He's saying it's absolutely essential. And to ignore it, in his eyes, that's a betrayal. The argument really starts with his name. See, the author points out that Jesus is the Greek version of his actual Hebrew name, which was Yeshua. But this isn't just about a name. The whole point is that he was a devout, Torah-observant Jew. He lived, he taught, he thought completely inside that first-century Jewish world.
Okay, so let's get into the evidence. How do we know this? Well, the author points to a huge shift in our historical understanding, and it's all thanks to incredible discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls. These finds have totally turned old assumptions about what languages people were actually speaking back then on their head. And check this out, this is what's so fascinating. This timeline shows a complete 180 in academic thinking. Look at this. Back in 1958, a major dictionary basically said Hebrew was a dead language by that point. But then you fast forward to 1997, and that same dictionary, thanks to new evidence, does a complete reversal. They confirm that, yep, Hebrew was very much a living, spoken language in the New Testament period. And this is a big reason why that thinking changed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this absolute treasure trove of documents from the right time period, are overwhelmingly in Hebrew. We're talking about 85%. Aramaic comes in a distant second, and Greek, it's barely even there. So the author uses this to say, look, Hebrew was the main event, it was the language for religion, for law, for serious stuff. But it doesn't stop there. The evidence just keeps piling up. You've got coins from the period stamped in Hebrew, military orders, legal documents, all in Hebrew. And this is a big one. Rabbinic parables, the exact style of teaching Yeshua was known for, were also written down in Hebrew. The source even points out that at one point an Aramaic translation was actually banned from the temple. That tells you just how central Hebrew was. Okay, so if Yeshua was teaching in Hebrew to a Hebrew-speaking audience, what happens when his story gets written down later in Greek for a totally different non-Jewish audience, a Hellenistic or Greek-influenced world? Well, according to the author, this is exactly where things get lost in translation, big time.
Now, to really get a key example of this, we need to know what tefillin are. Basically, they're these small leather boxes, and inside are tiny scrolls with verses from the Torah. Observant Jews wear them during weekday prayers. It's an act of devotion, a way of fulfilling a biblical commandment.
Okay, so here's where the author says a huge mistake happens right in the Gospel of Matthew. The Greek translator used the word phylacteries, but they were almost certainly trying to translate the Hebrew word tefillin. The problem? Phylacteries means something like protective charms or magic amulets, a totally different idea, completely foreign to the Jewish practice. The author says this pretty much proves the translator wasn't Jewish and just didn't get it, accidentally turning an act of devotion into something that sounds like superstition. So what's the big takeaway here? The author's conclusion is that the original Gospels were most likely written in Hebrew for an audience that lived and breathed the Torah every single day. And when those stories were translated into Greek, the translators, who just didn't have that cultural background, made little changes that had a huge impact. They unintentionally paved the way for a more Greek-influenced, and you could say less Jewish, version of the faith. All right, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, the author doesn't just leave it there. They actually lay out a path forward for anyone who wants to get back to what they call the original Yeshua Judaism. And they propose 3 main steps. First, you've got to consciously try to swap out that Greek-style mindset for a Hebraic, Torah-centered one. Second, they say we should take a fresh look at texts like the Epistle of James, which was written by Yeshua's brother, Yaakov. That book is all about living right and following the Torah, which is probably why Martin Luther famously didn't like it. And third, and this is key, they say to actually go and consult with Jewish scholars to really understand the original context. And they're really specific on that last point, too. They actually list modern Jewish scholars and schools that focus on this stuff, on the Jewish world of the New Testament. The implication is that to get the real story, you might have to look outside of traditional Christian scholarship. And all of this brings us to the final part of the argument. This is where the author takes all this history and language and turns it into a very direct, very personal challenge for anyone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus. It starts with a question about motive, really. How much do you really want to know and follow the historical person, Yeshua? Is it about following a tradition you've inherited, or is it about getting to the man as he actually was? And if you do want to know him, well, the next question is, how willing are you to really listen to him, even if what you find out challenges things you've believed your whole life, things that have been passed down for centuries? And that leads to the final, ultimate question that basically sums up the whole thesis. The author frames it as a choice between 2 different figures. Are you called to follow the Hebrew Yeshua, the Torah-observant, Hebrew-speaking rabbi, or the Greek Jesus, the figure who has been translated through a different culture? To wrap all of this up, the author brings it back to Professor David Flusser one last time, leaving us with this really powerful thought. For Flusser, this wasn't just an academic game. He believed that rediscovering the authentic, purified Judaism of Yeshua held one of the few real hopes, maybe the only hope, for our world. And that's a pretty big idea to leave you with.